Well, welcome everybody. It is our July FxD meeting, so lovely to see you all here. My name is Jenna Mikas. I'm the host and founder of Flourishing by Design, our special interest group. So great to see you all, whether it's morning, afternoon, or evening your time. It's 11 p.m. for me, so I'm going to introduce things today and then kind of step back to quietly observe the rest of the night. So here we go. All right, we begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands upon which we stand, including the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, where I find myself today and where our community began. We pay respects to their elders, lores, customs, and creation spirits, and to those of other Indigenous communities represented here today. We recognize that these lands have always been places of flourishing exploration through and by design, and that these lands were never ceded. So just a few quick announcements before we begin today's session. First, we are seeking a few different people for ambassadors and volunteers, so I'm going to talk about that in a moment. We have a book update, we have a writing club update, and then we're just going to talk about upcoming speakers and then tonight's speakers. So we are seeking some ambassadors and volunteers. If you're interested in helping to identify speakers, coordinate events, engage internal and external communities, maybe even create, manage website contact and workshop, it just depends, please get in touch. Activity and membership are really picking up, and we could use the support to ensure better quality communication, engagement, and connection to avoid too much reliance on LinkedIn and too much email. We just want to make sure that it's a little bit more streamlined. So if you're willing to help, that would be lovely. Also, for those of you interested in publishing opportunities, we have good news on the book project that we have been exploring. We recently achieved a really big hurdle just this week, and we received feedback that we got 3 positive reviews from our 3 reviewers. So it was incredibly positive, like even surprisingly so. And we expect to announce the book and put out a call for chapters formally in the coming week or 2 at the latest. I'm not able to share the publisher just yet until things are finalized, but I can say that this is a highly respected publisher in an established book series. The working title of our book is A Handbook for Curating Flourishing by Design in Unconventional Workplaces. I'll be sending out a formal call with details out to the community soon. But in the meantime, if you want, you might want to join our FxD Write Club that's led by Derek Cunningham. The next session, I believe, is scheduled for next Wednesday, possibly Tuesday for the time zone. But details can be found on the group LinkedIn page, or you can message me or Dara for more information. So next month, I've arranged to have Professor of Imagination Penny Hay of Bath Spa University come speak to us about the power of imagination and creativity. So I'm really looking forward to that session as we interrogate both the art and science behind design before we then do another 𝐵𝐻𝐻𝐿 session in September. So if you're interested in doing 𝐵𝐻𝐻𝐿, please sign up. I think I have a few people signed up for September as of now, but we'll go ahead and fill those final spots for the September session soon. And finally, the reasons that we're all here today, tonight's speakers, Tye Farrow and Nooshin Esmaeili. Last month, I attended EDRA in Halifax, Nova Scotia, and had the opportunity to join 2 brilliant minds to explore flourishing design together. And we have both of them with us tonight, or today, depending on your time zone. Our featured speaker is Tye Farrow, a pioneer in salutogenic design and a lovely all-around human and brilliant conversationalist whom I've had the chance to meet with on several occasions, from Melbourne to Helsinki and most recently Halifax. Tye will be introduced in more detail by our special guest interviewer in a moment. That guest interviewer is fellow FxD member Nooshin Esmaeili, whom I connected with last year and who has become a fast friend. Nooshin is a registered architect in Canada, sessional lecturer, and PhD candidate at the University of Calgary. Her research bridges architecture, philosophy, spirituality, neuroaesthetics, and environmental psychology to explore how the built environment shapes human cognition, well-being, and inner harmony. Rooted in sacred architecture and wisdom traditions, her work investigates the poetic and non-physical dimensions of space, revealing how design can foster eudaimonia, or human flourishing. Given our common interest in eudaimonia and design, you might see the synergies that resulted in our connecting last year. Nooshin is chair of the Canada chapter of the Academy of Neuroscience for Architecture, or ANFA, a senior researcher in a national partnership project entitled Quality in Canada's Built Environment, or QBE, and an award winner, including the prestigious OBEL Award Teaching Fellowship, which led her to the Kingdom of Bhutan, where she spent 6 months teaching a unique architectural studio course on architecture and well-being at the Royal University of Bhutan. We are delighted to have Nooshin with us today, introducing Tye for his talk before facilitating a conversation with him and then conducting Q&A with the group thereafter. So make sure to put your questions in the Q&A box or in the chat box, and we'll monitor that as we go. Thanks so much for being here today, Nooshin. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Jenna. Lovely to be here. I'm truly delighted to join you all here. Wherever you are in the world, it's just nice to get together and talk about the topic that both me, Jenna, and Tye, we all love and we flourish by discussing it. And it's thank you for the kind invitation, Jenna. And I deeply value, I want to say this beforehand, that the Flourishing by Design initiative by Jenna, I truly believe that in the time we're living right now, this is a really meaningful and rich initiative, and it offers a powerful platform for rethinking really how design can support human well-being and, after all, flourishing. And thank you for the introduction. I'm really honored to be here with my colleague, friend, and a very kind soul, Tye. Today, we'll be exploring some of the more intangible and yet deeply impactful dimension of design and flourishing, the emotional, sensory, neurological qualities, that all of them come together to shape how we feel and we experience space, and a little bit more beyond some physical qualities. We will discuss the fresh lens on how we define flourishing, one that connects the physical with the non-physical in the built environment and with our inner and delicate experience. And with that in mind, it's my pleasure to introduce someone who probably really doesn't need an introduction. He's really well known globally, but somebody who embodies this approach through his work, through his spirit, and you just have to meet this person in person, this individual in person, to see and feel what I'm talking about, because he lives and he truly shows it, not only with his work, but with his words and with his passion for this topic. You might all know that Tye is an internationally recognized architect. He's a thought leader at the intersection of architecture, neuroscience, and health. He is a pioneer in salutogenic design, which is all about creating spaces that don't just serve a function, but actually help people thrive and enriched environments for individuals. He was the first Canadian architect to earn a Master of Neuroscience applied to architecture from University of Venice. He also holds a degree from Harvard and also University of Toronto. His work spans the globe. His projects are really known for promoting well-being in powerful, measurable ways. So it's not just about the things that he talks about, but he actually puts them into practice, and he builds buildings, he makes buildings with all these concepts together. Tye's insight have inspired audience globally, and he just recently came back from an amazing event in Barcelona. He travels constantly all over the world, and his passion for human-centered design continues really to push the boundaries of what architecture can do for our health, happiness, and, after all, our true flourishing. Thank you, Tye, for being here. I know you have a presentation that you want to start with, so I'll pass it on to you.
Nooshin, thank you. How nice to see you, and I'm really looking forward, as I always do, to spend time with you to dive into some of these thoughts, and equally so, Jenna, thanks for bringing the two of us together to share time together. And certainly it was nice to see you in Halifax, both of you in Halifax together, and share some time together. I will try and share my slides. Let me know if they pop up. Let me know when you see them.
Coming is just, I think it's loading. Yeah, we see it now.
Terrific. So I want to try and connect the dots between this concept of flourishing, eudaimonia, and in fact, what our environments can do to actively feed us. And this idea that, we often don't really think about what our surroundings do to us, and we often think that ourselves and our surroundings are two separate things. Our ecological surroundings are separate from us, and clearly we realize that in fact isn't the case. And some really amazing stuff that's emerging that I'm sure many of you have come across that really begins to look at what our environments do and change our physiology and biology, and clearly shape and influence our memory and our emotions and our thoughts, and in fact our relationships with others. And this information, and certainly that's coming out of your organization also, Jenna, that this is really challenging where and how where our body ends and where the rest of the world begins. And this idea that cognitively through perception, that they're both tied together. They're one in the same. And I think the idea that this is really important for me tied back to this idea of flourishing and how we can create the conditions of which we can thrive and prosper as a result of the choices we make in our surrounding environments. And this idea that our body is like a big radar dish that's collecting so much information, every minute and every second, the statistic that, every second that, through all of our senses, we collect somewhere around 11 million bits of information, sensory information, which seems like a lot. But in fact, only 50 of that is conscious. But that doesn't mean that the rest of the information isn't flooding into our body. It is through all of our senses, conscious, pre-conscious, subconscious. And this idea that the information that comes in communicates between our mind and our body in different ways. Some is bottom up, some is top down, meaning that the mind, if you get pricked by a pin, your body tells your mind you better move. But if you have a great meal or you're chatting with somebody you're very fond of, or listening to a great concert, that uncomfortable feeling in your arm or your leg or whatever begins to wash away. And so this idea that placemaking's role in its ability, multisensorial, to enhance our health and well-being, physiological, biological, and psychological, is very much tied to this idea of human flourishing. And we talk a lot about high performance buildings, ecological health, mechanical, electrical envelopes on the building. But really shifting that discussion into thinking about human performance, what the building does to enhance our ability to learn, empathy, creativity, social interaction, learning as a result of the choices we make. And in fact, back to that concept, that important concept of human flourishing. And so trying to connect the dots between the places we create, our mind health specifically, and human flourishing is really what I want to walk into and really explore these ideas, but specifically through this lens that there is no such thing as neutral space. There's no space that sits in the middle that, again, doesn't have an impact on our health and well-being, either positive or negative. And Nooshin, as I think you were mentioning, really tying together this idea of mind health back to the emerging area of neuroscience and architecture. So if we walk a little further into this concept of environmental enrichment, I don't know how many of you have gotten into this. This scientist, Donald Herb, Heeb in the 1940s, took some of his mice from his lab into these sorts of enriched environments at home, and he found that the mice in these environments lived longer, were better at solving problems, and socially were more active. This research goes further into the 1960s by an amazing lady called Diamond, looking at environmental enrichment, mice that are in a base environment, in an impoverished environment, in an enriched environment. And what does she discover? She discovers that the mice that are in the enriched environments, in fact, their synapse grow at a tremendous rate compared to the mice in the baseline. The cortex thickens, and in fact, the mice in the impoverished environments, in fact, the opposite occurs. And so this idea that impoverished environments that lack optimal stimulation, not overstimulation, have the ability to, in fact, damage your brain. And is this the same in humans? In fact, the research looks at people in solitary confinement, from 15 to 20 to 30 years. And what do they discover? That in fact, that the people that are in solitary confinement, this guy, Robert King, in fact, they proved at the Supreme Court that the environment, in fact, damages the brain, in this case, specifically the hippocampus, meaning that space is not neutral. And so this idea of environmental enrichment, that any space we walk into, we have cognitive, precognitive experiences that impact our physiology and our psychology. And it has the ability to change our cortisol levels, which is on the stress side, our serotonin levels, which is on the well-being side, and in fact, all of these other aspects. And I think the important part to take away from it is that this isn't a new area of study. It's been in the works for about 50 years. I'm not going to get into all of these, except specifically the last one around place attachment theory. And basically what place attachment theory lays out is this idea that we form emotional relationships, person to place, the same way we form person-to-person relationships, and they're tied to this idea of a sense of coherence. And a sense of coherence is buttressed by these ideas I'll get into in a minute on comprehensibility, manageability, and meaningfulness. And this is at the roots of this concept of salutogenesis, and I think it ties very specifically to the concept of human flourishing. And so what I'd like to just walk a little further and deepen our understanding of salutogenesis. Aaron Antonovsky developed it in the late 1940s, and it really ties the roots of the word tie together this idea of solace and genesis, health and the origins, and they're really a very different concept, the opposite of that common word we know, pathogenics. And so it's really trying to unravel one of these great mysteries, how in fact we can create the conditions of which we can effectively cause health. And what I'd like to do is just tie this together with a couple other ideas. Maslow's hierarchy of needs, back to this idea of sense of coherence. I expect you're probably familiar with that. Hope theory, I don't know if you've got into Snyder's hope theory. I think it's a very important one. It's different than optimism, but one that to deepen your ideas on. But I think the four of these tie together around to this idea of eudaimonia. And I think you're all familiar with that. But I really want to intentionally tie those pieces together. But if we look at salutogenesis and in fact hope theory, it ties back to the concepts of comprehensibility, which is this idea of our perception and understandability about our internal and external spaces, manageability, which is the degree that we have the resources internally and externally in our surrounding environments to meet the requirements of daily life, And then this idea of meaningfulness, which I think is very important, that in fact we have purpose, a sense of purpose, and in fact we know our environments can support that. And I think this ties very clearly to this concept of biophilia theory that I suspect you're familiar with. I think Bill Browning's the leading thinker in that area, nature in space, the analogies of space. But I think it's also tied to a couple other theories, which is stress reduction theory, how nature can restore us, attention restoration theory. I'm moving through these fairly quickly. We can get into a discussion. Kaplan's theory of how natural environments can enhance concentration, and then back to voluntary and involuntary attention, which in fact the natural environment ties to. This ties to the important idea of affordances, how the environments can help us do something. Some of those are primary or metaphoric or motor. And that ties to signifiers. I don't know if you're familiar with that. I think it's very important for me how the environment communicates specific messages. And that's tied to this Japanese concept of shiitake, which is how the environment can gently nudge us forward to do things. That ties back to environmental enrichment. And I think, Nooshin, we can get into a discussion on that, which ties back to place attachment theory that we talked about, and the constructed theory of emotion. I think we can get a little further into. But I just want to say that the qualities of enriched environments tie to how we build relationships, person to person and person to place. And I'm just going to show very quickly a couple examples of our works on how we can begin to use environmental enrichment in market areas, in learning spaces, all to create the conditions of which we can thrive and prosper, such as this cancer center, communicating very specific messages around generosity. Environments like this that are retreats in the countryside, that you can get away to nourish yourself, and then something we're involved in a spiritual aspect that's sort of inspired by this nest, which is a new temple that is trying to be both in and of the forest, that begins to speak to the different seasons, the changing daylight and mood, both on the inside and the outside, to try and enhance some of these ideas. Why is this all important to me? Why is it important in these ideas of placemaking, which is really trying to tie to this idea of human flourishing? And if you have more interest in that, there's a book that I've written called Constructing Health, How the Built Environment Enhances Your Mind Health. But maybe we can get a little further into that in our discussion. So why don't that was a bit of a, for everybody that's up early in the morning, that should maybe be a little bit of an espresso, all of the theories to get this thing beginning to work first thing in the morning. So why don't we stop there and see if we can get into a bit of a discussion, Nooshin. Hop, hop,
Thank you,
hop.
Tye. That was lovely. It was a quick intro and a great introduction to an amazing work that you're doing. Thank you so much for sharing that. There's so much to talk about because you touched upon so many different theories, so many important aspects of what the built environment needs to have and what we're missing. And I think what you talked about, the various different theories, it does talk about enriched environments and how it can activate neuroplasticity, stimulate creativity, even reduce cortisol level, as you mentioned. But I guess on a deeper level, your talk and the work you're doing, it also talks about mirroring back to us and who we are and who we might become through the built environment, through the physical world, because as you mentioned, the physical, we are in physical world all the time, whether we're interior, whether we're in outside spaces, landscape, residential, commercial, we're constantly in space. So I think understanding that architecture that supports coherence doesn't just help us, but just doesn't just shelter us and help us survive, but it does help us to remember ourselves and engage more deeply with life and more towards understanding who we are as a person, towards that flourishing that we talk about. And it becomes that co-creator in our journey towards that wholeness and meaning. So on that note, maybe I'll start with a very basic question, which I think it's very fundamental, understanding when we talk about human flourishing in the built environment, what do we really mean? Like, what do you define as human flourishing, Tye? And what does it really mean to you when you talk about enrichment, talk about human flourishing?
The enrichment side for me is so important because there's a lot of work and amazing studies that are happening in relationship to us in the built environment that's really looking at stress reduction, which is effectively stopping bad things from happening to us. Because we know a lot of environments we're in where we live, where we work, where we play, where we heal, that do cause stress, or in fact, the commuting also. And why aren't we going back to the office? Because we've discovered places that are wonderful to be that feed and nourish us. And so the human flourishing program is so important for me. Is it's not only stopping bad things from happening, but it's in fact flipping it around to how can your space actively feed and nourish you, pack you for, full of the equivalent to architectural supervitamins that nourish, all of your organs and body and your mind as a result of the design choices we make. And so that ties back to salutogenesis. I think flourishing and salutogenesis are so well tied together because wherever we are, even if we've gone through traumas and we're badly beat up, there is still the ability to feed and nourish and pack us full of great things, comprehensibility, manageability, and meaningfulness of the choices we make, but intentionally do that so that we can become the best version of which we are. And the environment, clearly, the science is showing the mind and the neuroscience, cognitive science intersection, are abundant. And so the ability to communicate this and intentionally act on it.
That's a very good response. And you mentioned some of the words that popped up in my mind is one, you said that buildings and a design architecture can heal. And also you talked about intentionality. I think those are the two really important words that we can probably explore a bit more in when we design buildings, when we design built environments, that yes, built environment can heal us. Yes, it can harm us, but it can also heal us. And that intentionality that you talk about often is that prioritizing what comes first. What do we really need to add instead of this? It's not that one is not important, is the priority. And I guess in various different types of building, this is different. Like in a school environment, intentionality and prioritizing various different concepts or various different items are different than when it's commercial, when it's residential, when it's a senior home. So I think that's very important for designers, for builders, for researchers to think about that. But then I guess I come to this question that in your work, when you design, when you build, especially you work internationally in various different cultures, in various different environments, then how do you measure this flourishing in design? Like, how do you, is it through subjective experience? Is it through you do a charade, a community feedback? Is it, do you have specific tools, a framework you go through? And if you, what is that framework that you use? And maybe what is it that's missing that you think because I know some of the audience here are probably researchers, including myself, understanding what's missing right now in the field that we need to look out a little bit more.
The idea of really what I'm really excited about these days is the ability to track how environments change. Your physiology and biology are becoming so really easy, non-invasive, and not expensive. And I just want to step back, and I think I'll throw this out to the crowd on, can environments heal us? There's a lot of discussion around that. What I do know is environments do have the ability to change our physiology and biology, like we've heard through the work in environmental enrichment. What I do know is environments can nurture us and feed us, and the idea of space as a non-invasive therapeutic treatment. So the idea between healing, nurturing, and non-invasive treatment, I think there's really interesting discussion around that we can get into. The nourishing, I really like that word because it's very clear. The question is how can we really confirm, is it subjective or not? And I think it's all of the above, but let's just say also that those, funny feelings in our stomach, those aren't just funny feelings or butterflies. They're our body communicating to our mind bottom up that in fact we should do something around it. The area that really excites me, and we're just beginning to dive into it to get some studies going on it, some amazing partners on that, is in the area of heart rate variability. Why is heart rate variability so amazing? Heart rate variability tells when there's a point in time when your body is being nourished and regenerated, but it's also at a point in time what would be, I think you could tie to the concept of flourishing. And heart rate variability, as you may or may not know, your heart rate, if you're stressed, your heart rate can race, or if you're calm, it can be slow. But heart rate variability is also something that can occur when you're in a resting mood, or you walk around the corner and you see the love of your life that you haven't seen for a while. Your heart rate variability will go up. So the ability to link that to environments that again feed you in a positive way is a really, for me, an important area. And there's some early research on that. Bill Browning's done some interesting stuff on biophilia between classrooms, little kids that are in a regular classroom, other kids that are in more of a biophilia enriched environment. And in fact, it shows that the heart rate variability is significantly higher, which then ties back to student improvement. So this idea of using space as a non-invasive therapeutic treatment that has the ability to create the conditions of which you thrive and flourish, to be able to quantify that, we're pushing further into it, so that we move away from what would be deemed the subjective or the intangibles, and tying the intangibles to things that clearly are very tangible.
Thank you. I think I completely agree with the heart rate, because what comes to my mind is that I know a lot of researchers, including Julio Bermudez. He does a lot of work on understanding how that heart rate or the fluctuation in our feelings and emotions change as we enter various different building types. And because of my interest in transcendental architecture, beyond the physical form, beyond the secular architecture, I see that the heart rate when you enter a sacred space, or when you enter a space that's enriched. I always remind myself of your burger example and the enriched bowl of food, that when you go into that building, your heart rate changes. And I know research shows that it even brings you to a meditative state. So your heart rate is compared exactly as if you were meditating for 20 minutes, 15 minutes. That's your heart rate, and brain waves come down to that level. So understanding how powerful our built environment is, I think it's really rich to know that it can impact us. And then maybe it's here that I want to dive into a little bit of our internal state, that sometimes we're constantly thinking of measuring, that if we're not able to measure it, it doesn't count. If we're not able to scientifically prove it, it doesn't count. But they are, as you said, those butterfly feelings, or those moment of awe and transcendental feeling that you feel as a person. And it varies definitely based on our cultural backgrounds, based on our beliefs, personality, if you're female versus a male, it all changes. And maybe I want to dive a little bit into those internal states, those inner feelings that are more intangible and we're not able to measure them. And how do you see that connected to human flourishing? And do you see that architecture can act as a bridge to those internal states? And if yes, then maybe what kind of, have you experienced in any of your design? Like, have anybody come to you and say, oh, this design does this to me, or yourself? Or can we maybe elaborate a little bit on this and maybe open it up a little bit from the physical to the, I don't want to say metaphysical, but from the physical to from the within to the without, from the external to the internal?
Well, the one that really helps me make sense around that is Barrett's work on the constructed theory of emotion. I mentioned it, but I didn't get into it. But what she really lays out is this idea. She actually doesn't really talk as much about space, and I haven't reached out and connected with her because I think the theory is very important to space, which effectively says there's an inside world which we shape and imagine, and it's different for all of us, as you've mentioned. And there's an external world, and there's a play that goes back and forth where the external world communicates messages to all of us, to us through all of our senses, through sight, sound, smell, touch, taste, and kinesthetics, sort of lesser known sense of our movement in space, as well as our vestibular system, where we're positioned in a space and how that interprets. But that information comes in, and the important thing is, as you mentioned, it is shaped by things we've experienced, often cultural, or things we've done or learned. And with that information, we make a prediction if we're comfortable or not. But the important thing is that those important extraordinary movements are shaped by our interpretations of all of these things. And I think it's formally known as aesthetic interpretation. What's an example of that? Let's take the iconic picture, the painting of the Last Supper with 13 people sitting around the table. So you can view that really on three different levels, sort of a pre-iconic level. You can view it really on a iconographic level, and then you can tie it both to your culture. What does that mean? In the first instance, you look at it and you interpret around color and line, and culture's not associated. So there's 13 people sitting around. What are they doing? Well, they're having dinner. Okay. If we then take it to the iconographic sort of level that's more universal, then we say, okay, well, I see 13 people, they're around a table. That must be, they're having maybe Thanksgiving dinner or, some kind of important relationship. But if we then take it to the cultural overlays, it then shifts us more into, well, this is the Last Supper, and the fate of somebody is going to be quite something. And then there's the movement into sort of a spiritual understanding on it. So if you take that same interpretation of the environments we create, that can speak to us differently culturally on a different level. I like to tie it back to the analogy of how we build relationships as ingredients that we add, like cooking. And I know we've had a lot of discussion around that on Persian food and experienced it. But the way that we mix these ingredients, your interpretation and my interpretation, I mean, that meal, could remind you of your grandmother's cooking or what she taught you. And for me, it just reminds me of an extraordinary meal together with somebody that will stick, and the mix of those flavors will always remind me of something. But space as exactly the same thing, that we are packing it actively with minerals and vitamins that move beyond the hamburger that's transactional, that does only what it's asked, to the meal, the Persian meal that we had, that moves us and nourishes on many levels. Space is exactly the same.
Wonderful. Yeah, it truly is. And I think this is a great analogy, talking about those details and those adds on, that it's different for each culture. And I think that's what we need to understand, is that on various different levels, on various different types of architecture, the enrichedness or the health and well-being side of it, it's different. We need to understand that not every place is similar, right?
Yeah, and just one thing I really want to put an exclamation mark on is the usual thing as well. This is going to cost a lot of money, and how can we afford
Yes.
it? I mean, the pictures I showed, for the most part, are all for, nonprofit organizations that have zero money to spend on their buildings, and in fact, zero money in the operating costs also. It isn't about cost. It is about priorities. That
Yes.
idea that, your shopping list and my shopping list for home, there's lots of things on it we'd like to have, but we have to prioritize. Space is exactly the same thing. What is going to create the conditions for social interaction and empathy? And if you and I are working together, that creates places we want to come together and share and solve a lot of the problems. So I just want to really emphasize that point, that this isn't a cost issue, it's a priorities and choice issue.
Thank you. Thank you for clarifying. That was one of my questions too, because we often are asked by the client, oh, but that's going to cost too much. Oh, but that's not necessary. We're already over budget. But if it happens at the beginning of the design stage, if we do it all the way at the beginning and prioritize what's needed, what do you really want to get out of this project? Then it becomes necessary. Then at the end, it's not something. It's not an add-on that we put on. I know we're 15 minutes to the end of the session, and I want to leave some time at the end for all of you to ask questions. One final thing, looking ahead, looking at education, at the future generation of architects and designers who want to move beyond just sustainability, beyond towards a regenerative, toward enriched design. What do you advise for our education system? I know we have researchers, we have practitioners here in the audience. What do you suggest we shift the needle towards? What are some of the things that you've seen and that we need to, I know that there needs to be a systematic change. It's not just one thing that needs to be added on, but what do you suggest in the research, in education, in the field of practice? What is necessary that needs to happen for us to be able to create these environments?
The idea of focusing totally on health creation, and it can be planetary health, or there's a lot of ideas around there. But if we look at activating optimal health, the analogy for me is it's like a table with a beautiful, a vase of flowers on top of it. And to support that table, to activate optimal health, the four legs represent the things that activate health. And the first one, a lot of architectural schools and architects are focused on, is design's impact, positive or negative, on ecological health. We're focused a lot on that, on the carbon aspect. You see, we use a lot of mass timber. That's very important, but that's only one leg of the puzzle. The second thing is around our physical health. We're in a period of a tsunami of of problems around our physical health. But how do environments encourage us to move, to walk on the streets, to run up and down stairs? Design has a significant impact on that. Clearly, we know design has a significant impact on societal health. Society is beginning to seem to go further and further and further, depending on what country you are, or certainly where the flourishing program is based. It's like, but how does space create the conditions of which we can come together and share and spend time together? And design has a big role in it. But then the fourth leg is really that issue of design's impact on mind health through multimodal, multisensorial experiences, the phenomenology of space. We've moved away from the phenomenology of space
Mhm.
and specifically our body's experience in space. I mean, we use a lot of computer renderings to communicate visually things about space. We use a lot of material boards to realize the tactile nature of it. We worry about noise, reducing noise, then increasing sound and the sound that nourishes us. Um, and all of the other multisensorial, we seem to be a bit removed from that. So my sense is we got to move out of the silos, you know, everybody trying to be simply, the most sustainable as everybody else, but add all of these other pieces into the equation and move away from that sort of René Descartes rationalist view, the 17th
Yes.
century philosopher that, the mind and the body is separate. We know that's not true, and we know that anything that's in silos doesn't work particularly well. So I think it's just beginning to widen how we learn and teach and understand architecture.
Thank you. I completely agree that it is necessary for us to go back a little bit to ourselves. I think technology, the amount of data we receive daily, and we're constantly looking outside. We're constantly looking into our phones or computers, and we're constantly looking for the answers outside of ourselves. And sometimes I think that's why, for me at least, walking in nature, I hug trees all the time. It might sound crazy, but just reconnecting with nature. I take my shoes off. I ask my students, take your shoes off, walk on the grass. We do that a lot at the beginning of the course. Just try to connect with ourselves as a person, as an individual, and then connect with each other, and then connect with the world. I think that's a really valuable feedback. Thank you, Tye. We do have some questions from the audience that I'm going to ask those. Please feel free to share any other questions you might have in the Q&A. If we're not able to answer the questions today, we can share it with Tye later on, and I think he'll be willing to answer those questions as well. The first one is from Pete. He's saying, is there a post-occupancy evaluation or building performance evaluation framework that can accommodate measures of human flourishing?
We are certainly at the early stages of it, and they can be qualitative or quantitative. Some of the information that we find from post-occupancy discussions is really trying to get into some of the metrics around what the building is doing to help the strategic values of the organization. We've done some at the early stages with this cancer center that I showed you. And what's fascinating for me is you look at employee attraction and retention. It's, that building is in the highest in that of any other department on a 1 million square foot campus. and in fact looking at patient satisfaction scores that are very, very high. I can probably share something with people afterwards that we can circulate, but it's a very good lens to view assessing our buildings, that then can be used to communicate that to future clients.
Thank you, Tye. The other question is from Tristan, talking about smaller firms with less resources, shorter timelines, and time to dedicate to research. What's the most valuable way to take advantage of all of the research being released? I think of AI analysis, but this reduces the integrity and still requires review. What do you think?
I think in the intersection of neuroscience and architecture, there's certain barriers for people to walk into because of what is deemed research. And I'm not so sure that's the case if you have all of the resources or no resources. The observational side of the impact of what you build is, I think, a very, very good starting point. And then there's a lot of the technologies that are out there. They're very inexpensive, like back to the heart rate variability. Like you can get a sensor that is less than $100. So the first message is not to be afraid of doing research, and if it's straight observational, or if it's through interviews of what pre and post, if somebody's in an old space compared to the new space, to just begin to talk to people on what they believe the impact of the space has been on them, or what the qualitative aspects are, tangible or intangible, is just beginning the discussion on it. And I think it'll allow you to go further and further into maybe more wearables or other pieces of things that become more, what one might say, scientific.
Yeah, and I also think Academy of Neuroscience for Architects, ANFA, they have a lot of great resources. And I think we all, if we want to step into this field, we need to start educating ourselves. And I know we do that sometimes through lunch and learn at the companies, or just talking to individuals, inviting them to come and share their resources or their research with us. And that also really helps educate the company and the employees to understand, because everybody needs to be on board to understand what's happening and what's the measures.
Yeah, and like, why did I write the book? I did this Master of Neuroscience degree, and there's probably 100 books that I went through, and a lot of them, often in the neuroscience or the scientific, are very, very hard to digest. Back to the food analogy, that you got some indigestion because of the way either they're written scientifically or the way architects write also. They're hard to digest. The reason I wrote the book was to try and pull this stuff together in a way that's digestible, it's accessible, and will allow a wider group of people to walk into the discussion, and connect the dots. It's got a good bibliography, a glossary of terms, but it just tries to give people the tools to understand this a little further.
Thank you. Another question, do you think climate change is becoming an increasingly frequent obstacle to achieving health supportive spaces?
I would flip it around and say that climate change is in fact the opportunity for that creates a wider societal awareness of the health of the planet. But again, beginning to then connect the dots that it's not just the health of the planet, but it's also what that does to our own individual health. And again, back to the four aspects of community health, physical health, and mind health, tied to ecological health. So I think both climate change and arguably COVID was the best thing for beginning to realize the importance of of mind health, which, you know, we're not going back to the office for a specific reason. We don't like that commute that we had to endure, and we're in other environments that in fact that feed and nourish us. So I think it's our awareness now as a result of these external factors has really brought it home and is an opportunity.
Thank you. I think that's all the questions. I think there's one more by Karina.
Yes, we have one, Karina, and then one for Pete has a follow-up.
Okay, sure. Karina's asking, how do you determine meaningful human flourishing parameters to approach the conceptualization of a specific project under the premise that each project is unique and client users tends to have a little zero to understanding of these terms?
So back to salutogenesis. Salutogenesis is a very complicated word. And I don't usually talk about that much with our clients, but I talk about this idea of a sense of coherence. And a sense of coherence is easier to walk into, and specifically the words of comprehensibility, manageability, and meaningfulness. What's an example of that? Comprehensibility. When you walk up to the front of the building, do you know where the front door is?
Mhm.
And we know a lot of buildings we don't. Manageability, when you walk in the front door and you're trying to get to a department, you know, those buildings where you've got a red line and a green line and a blue line, the reason for that is the manageability is very, very poor. And then this idea of meaningfulness, that again, why aren't we working in the office? That, you know, these environments aren't feeding us. So if you look at, I think those are very easy for people to walk into, those words, and then being able to use examples that describe them, tied back to the strategic operational strategies of an organization. But I think they're a very easy lens to look at, specifically through different cultures, different building types, different organizations. But what is the building doing to help your sense of coherence or sense of purpose, organizational sense of purpose, individual sense of purpose? And just as you as an employee going to work in the morning, is it comprehensible, manageable, and does it have meaning?
Mhm.
So I find it's easy. We've talked to people on the housing side, on healthcare centers, and it seems people can walk into the concept as opposed to the tongue twister of salutogenesis.
Thank you, Tye. And I'll pass it to Pete for your second question. Pete?
Thank you. And I know that we're at the top of the hour, so I appreciate the time. So I'm asking the question from like 12 years working in commercial architecture, specifically with workplace. And I guess as a follow-up to my question about POEs and metrics, et cetera, I'm really interested more in like the business case argument, and I, agree with everything you're saying, and I, appreciate the work. My work often has involved, dealing with very cynical real estate uh, professionals. And how do you pitch this to a uh, commercial office operator? How do you build a business case for this? I mean, it's easy. Well, it's not easy. It's a little more straightforward to do when you're talking about a healthcare environment or a learning environment. But if you were to apply this broadly across commercial workplace, enterprise workplace, how would you begin to approach it?
So your question is the fundamental question. And in fact, we're just beginning to move into it around the salutogenesis side. We'll probably be a little further a year down the road. We had a discussion in Barcelona last week with it. How do these things get applied? The thing you're getting to the root is because architects speak a different language than the CFO of an organization, or in fact, maybe the CEO. Most don't speak the language of architecture, and we often don't speak the language of business. And the one where we're going is in a direction specifically around that, but I'd like to refer you to a document that I think is extraordinary, which is Bill Browning's book on the economics of biophilia. It's fantastic because it lays out the business case. For example, he talks about, they did a study of hotel rooms that have, say, a decent view or don't have a decent view, of nature specifically. The rates they can charge are significantly higher. He gets into all of the economics of it. And that's exactly where we need to go. I think his resource is extraordinary. And what you're talking about is exactly where we need to go, specifically around flourishing salutogenesis for me. Because if you can speak the language of the CFO, then everybody connects the dots to it. We speak that language to the leaders of healthcare organizations. And I can show the metrics that I can improve their employee retention and attraction, and in fact, patient satisfaction scores. If I can do that, then the reaction is full speed ahead, Tye. But you've hit the nail on the head. Look at Bill Browning's, search it. He's got another one on green building, the economics of green building. And I think he's very, very clever on going that angle. And he's got all the data, the metrics that support it. So I think that's a resource. I think he's a very, very clever guy, and certainly he's well into the neuroscience side of things.
And I've shared
Thank
the
you, Jen, for
link to the
dropping it
book.
in the
Yeah,
chat.
yeah.
It's
It's in the
amazing.
chat, Tye, so everybody can check that out. It's really good. And I would suggest certification and accreditation bodies too. A lot of them have worked through the economic sense of these arguments, so that helps as well.
Okay, well,
Yeah,
thank you,
it's
everyone.
the key.
Thank you so much for the time. Thank you, Tye, for joining us. Thank you, Jenna, for organizing this. I'll pass it on to Jenna to close the session. But thank you, everybody, for being here, for the wonderful questions you asked. We probably need another 3-4 hours. The discussion is just fruitful. Thank you for being here. I'll pass it to Jenna. Thank you.
Wonderful. Well, thank you both for being here. It was such a pleasure to be able to have this conversation. As you said, I mean, we could very easily spend ages talking about all of these topics, but we touched upon some really great subject matter. I love that we got into salutogenesis. For those of you who might not know too much about that background, we can clearly talk about that sometime for Antonovsky's viewpoint of that, which I think would certainly warrant a full conversation. And being able to dork out about eudaimonia so much was just lovely. Talk about being our best selves and curating for that, which is really spectacular. And of course, getting into the quant and the qual values of exploring some of the subject matter too. So thank you so much for the questions that everybody brought. We didn't quite get to all of them, but we will go ahead and maybe see if Tye will be kind enough to provide some answers to those offline. So thanks everybody for joining us, and we will see you next month.
And nice
Thank
to
you
see you
all.
both.
Yeah,
Thank
you as
you,
well,
Tye.
Tye. Thank you. And thank you, Nooshin.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.